So welcome to today's webinar, everyone. My name is Will Marion. I am the co-founder of the Positive Group. Today, we're going to be looking at the subject of stress. And we've had such high uptake for today's webinar, which I think is testament to the relevance of the topic in today's world. It's a subject that we are seeing, or we're certainly seeing stress on the increase. Some of the data that we've been looking at this week, actually from the US, who are no doubt going through some serious stress at the moment, is actually looking at the fact that nearly 8 in 10 adults say that the coronavirus pandemic is a significant source of stress in their lives. And we're also seeing that 2 in 3 of those say they've experienced increased stress over the course of the pandemic. And I think we shared some data in the last webinar around some of the data around anxiety. And once again, we're seeing this disproportionate impact on younger generations. And Gen Z was highlighted in that APA research that they're really getting impacted. So in the workplace, this is people who are sort of 18 to 24-year-olds who are going to be bearing the brunt of this. And I think that what this is going to have an impact on is obviously our psychological health. It's going to have an impact on the way our minds are operating, but it's also going to have an impact on our physical health. And this is something that Positive are really interested in: stress and what we call the stress mindset. So the psychology of stress, which really looks at our relationship with stress and the impact of that on our experience of stress, is a huge area of research and development for us. We actually have a whole module that looks at this concept of the stress mindset and what are the skills that we can build to manage stress in a better way. To dig into this topic today, I'm joined by 2 brilliant colleagues who are both experts in their field, both psychologists. We've got Dr. Elle Crush, who leads our insights team. She's done a PhD in psychological resilience, and she's been doing some brilliant research over the last 6 months around the impact of stress in the workplace, which we're going to dig into shortly. Also joined by Sinead.
Hello.
Dr. Sinead Devine-French, who's an educational psychologist, leads our product development and our R&D team, and has a real interest in particularly the stress mindset. So we're in very good hands as ever. Let's kick off. So Elle, I'm going to come to you first. We talk, I think everyone talks about stress, but it is very subjective. I think it'd be great to get a sort of academic perspective on that to sort of build on for today's webinar. Can you share something around that?
Yeah, so hi everyone. So I think it's quite useful to start with a definition of stress. So we feel stressed when we perceive that the external demands that are placed upon us in a given situation actually exceed our internal resources or abilities. So essentially, there's kind of a disconnect between the external environment and the challenge that sort of poses to us and what we feel like internally we can cope with. So there's sort of that psychological nature to stress. And if we perceive that there's an imbalance, so the external demands are too great relative to what we can, sort of our internal resources at that point in time, we feel stressed. And the greater the imbalance, the more stress we feel. And I think this highlights how stress is really individualistic, because if you have a group of people that all go through the exact same event, we'll all sort of appraise the external demands in our own way, but we'll also appraise our own sort of internal resources in relation to that challenge differently. So that sort of indicates why we can sort of experience very different levels of stress in comparison to others. And I also think it's important to mention that there are very sort of different types of stressors. So if we think of stressors as the sort of external sources of stress, as opposed to how we feel internally about stress. So there are kind of these chronic stressors. So things, big life events that happen that can cause really high levels of stress very quickly. So these are things like bereavement or retirement, or divorce, or sort of losing a job, financial insecurity. So what tends to happen in those situations is people feel very stressed very quickly. But there's also these sort of everyday lower level stressors. So having that sort of lots of deadlines at work or having something happen at home. And they're not big life events, but what happens with stress is it's cumulative. So what can happen is we sort of have lots of stresses happening in different aspects of our life. And these kind of stack up on top of each other. And so what happens is we start to find the external demands sort of accumulate. So we start to feel more stressed. And so you can move from a sort of a low, a medium to a high stress based on lots of little individual stresses that collectively are making us feel like our internal resources are sort of being exceeded.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things about the pandemic is you're seeing a bit of both of this, aren't you? So you got some of those big life events. I mean, you mentioned financial insecurity and job loss, etc., which is obviously affecting some, and also people we know. But there's also this compounding factor, and some of those stressors that were pre-pandemic are still there, so they're remaining. So the pandemic is therefore this sort of significant compounding factor on top of that. Sinead, just to come to you, I mean, it's stress. We talk a lot about stress being really normal. It affects all of us. Well, I mean, actually, that's the first question. Does it actually affect all of us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think stress is something that is very much part of the human condition. And I think you'd be hard pushed to find someone who never experiences stress. So I think what does differ from person to person is our capacity to manage stress. And even within person, so my own capacity to manage stress can vary over time in relation to lots of different variables, and lots of different factors can shift that. But up front, I think what's really important to say on the normalization front is that stress is normal. It is part of our day-to-day lived experience and reality. And what we seek to do in our work at Positive is to normalize and then to educate people around the things that we can do that are evidence-based to help us manage that stress response. And I think the reason that this is so important to put up front is that we need to counter the narrative that all stress is bad, because that narrative has pervaded and persisted for a long time. And the danger with that narrative is that we can become very aversive to stress. We're trying to avoid it at all costs, and we get distressed when we invariably encounter it. So I start to think, what's wrong with me? Why am I not coping when everyone else does? And that starts to compound the stress that we experience. And I think that's not helpful in terms of the real world, and it doesn't set us up for success. So I think what we know is that we will each of us encounter setbacks, challenges, stresses. And I think 2020 has been a real kind of masterclass and a reminder to all of us that that is the case. And I think what we look to do at Positive really is to start to counter that narrative by exploring the role that stress does play in our day-to-day lives and how it impacts things like how we think, how we perform, our relationships with each other. And so I was going to, Will, just share my screen and just bring up a model that I think really helps to bring this to life. So bear with me, and I'll not try to get too stressed as I bring this up. So hopefully you can see that now. Now this model is, so this is the Yerkes-Dodson model, and this looks at that link between how we perform day to day and the level of stress that we encounter. Now the key takeaway from this model is that we need a certain level of stress in our lives to enable us to perform at our best, to feel at our best, and to be engaged and enjoying the journey. And I think that's a really important message to explore. So if we consider this model on the left-hand side, where I have zero stress or pressure in my life. So if I'm playing tennis against someone that doesn't hit the ball back, I'm bored, I'm frustrated, I'm underwhelmed, time drags, and it's not a good place for the human psyche, for our psychology, for our physical health. And if we look at unemployment statistics, we can really see that play out. If we get stuck in that space for long periods of time, it has a detrimental impact. But as you move along the x-axis and you're moving into a higher stress state, and this is what we in psychology call eustress or good stress. So this is where I'm playing tennis against someone who's as good as me, if not a little bit better. I'm engaged, I'm enjoying it, I'm motivated, time's flying. This is when we're taking things off our to-do list, and it feels really, really good for us. We enjoy that space. Now then, as you continue to move further along into the high stress space, this is where things kind of get more interesting, and this is where we do need to be cautious about how we manage the stress that we encounter. Now, if we think about cortisol, which we kind of dubbed as the stress hormone, which, to be fair, I think that's really unfair, because cortisol is present in our system throughout the day, and cortisol is present in the absence of stress. So its key function really is to give us a burst of energy. So we have higher levels of cortisol when we wake up in the morning. We have higher levels of cortisol when we exercise or we exert ourselves. But we also get spikes in our levels of cortisol when we experience high levels of stress. Now, the first thing to say is that this isn't necessarily a bad thing. So we've evolved this lovely stress response. So when something comes along and is challenging to us, is threatening to us, the cortisol spikes, our adrenaline spikes, and we're mobilized to take action. So that's the kind of stress response that we're going after. We're able to focus in on the threat and then take action to move back up top to that eustress or good stress. So that's the kind of healthy adaptive stress response. I think where the challenge comes, and where this unhelpful narrative and kind of the media story and the literature story around this comes from, is where we get stuck in this high stress state. So this is where burnout occurs. This is a very real challenge for people, and it's a real experience of people's day-to-day lives. That's when we kind of get stuck here. Now, that cortisol that in the short term can be really helpful to us because it enables us to focus on the threat. In the long term, it can really start to play havoc. So if I'm playing tennis against Serena Williams, that's not a good space for me to be in. So I think what's interesting about this is, how do you know when you move into this space? And just to caveat, I suppose, our approach to this, what we're not saying is that stress isn't bad for you. What we are saying is that you can't avoid stress day to day. So learning to manage it and learning to live with it is key. And that actually there's a certain level of stress that's good for us, that can kind of optimize our performance and our enjoyment of day-to-day life. So what's really interesting is then starting to identify the high stress space for each and every one of us. So how do I tell when I'm in that space? What's my stress signature? So for some people, it might be disturbed sleep. It might be your memory or your decision-making is impaired. It might be headaches or stomach aches. So understanding what your signature is key, that awareness, and then being able to take action to move from the distress state to kind of de-stress through that back up to the top to where you're in eustress. And that's what we're really interested in.
No, absolutely. And that's really helpful. And I think it's such a great model, isn't it, to explain that relationship between stress, pressure, and performance. I think one of the things that we talk a lot about is how sticky it is when you go onto that right hand side, and it's very hard to then actually to bounce back, because you are in a stress state. You actually think, feel, behave in a different way, which is why building the skills, the skills to go into there and then be able to come back are so important. That's really helpful. I think what would be good I'm got to apologize, there's some noise going on in the street outside, so sorry if that's coming through. Elle, just wanted to come to you for a second. I know that you've been doing some research around this with our clients and looking at a lot of the psychological health factors that are happening in organizations, particularly over the last couple of months. Are you able to share that? Because I know there's been some really interesting findings, particularly around stress and our relationship with stress.
I can. Yeah. Can you see you can see the slides?
We can.
Great. So yes, we've been collecting data during the pandemic at different stages, and our most recent data collection happened in September. And here we asked around 700 professionals how stressed they've felt over the past 2 weeks. And we asked them to score this on a scale of 1 to 10. And so their responses are shown by the orange bars on the graph. And I think what's really interesting is if you look at the percentage of people who are reporting relatively high stress. So the average stress level is reported to be 6 out of 10, which consistently across 2 weeks is pretty high. And then actually over a third of individuals are reporting their stress levels to be 8 out of 10 or higher. And I think linked to these, some of the things we've talked about, we know that there are probably a higher proportion of individuals experiencing sort of more life events this year linked to unemployment and different factors. But there's also lots of additional stresses linked to the pandemic. So I think these figures are higher than we typically expect to see, and that's kind of consistent with a lot of the data out there, because unfortunately people are feeling pretty stressed, and these are sort of this is a very high functioning group. And then we're looking at, so now I just want to highlight the sort of the line that goes above the bar chart. So this is the kind of the average psychological health scores of each of the groups based on stress. So what you can see is this sort of adverse linear relationship. So people that are reporting very high levels of stress are reporting relatively low well-being. And obviously, this is kind of a well-known association, and all of these experiences are subjective. But what we do is we also have variables which indicate levels of anxiety, depression, uncertainty, things like sleep, lots of other things. And these psychological health measures do really correlate with all of these more objective measures around psychological health. So this association is a very real one. And I think what's most interesting, obviously, it's not good if we've got people experiencing high stress levels persistent over time. So high stress levels, short-lived, are less concerning. But I think in terms of thinking about people who are extremely stressed, so like this group who are 8 out of 10 or higher, there are some individuals that despite this do report actually relatively higher well-being than others. So there are differences in this group. And what happens in a lot of resilience literature is you try and understand, okay, so there's a group who are experiencing very high stress, but some people are managing it better than others. And what can you learn from that in order to help and support those who are perhaps managing less well? And linked to that, stress mindset has become a really interesting part of the literature. So how we think about stress, whether we believe stress is bad for us or not. So obviously stress is a very adverse feeling. So off the back of that, we can think about, humans are very good at thinking about their thoughts and thinking about how they feel. So if they feel stressed, they might then respond by thinking, oh no, this stress is really bad for me. And then that can actually make you more stressed, where others might experience stress and don't necessarily assume the stress they experience is bad for them. And you see quite significant differences between individuals in how bad they believe that stress is for their health, even if they were experiencing reporting, say, similar levels of health. People differ in the extent to which they believe it's bad for them. So what we then did in our data set was to test this hypothesis. And we looked at the group who report their stress levels to be 8 out of 10 or higher. So this is kind of the super stress group. And what we did was we distinguished between those in that group who believed stress was bad for them and those who didn't believe stress was bad for them. And what we found was this fact was able to sort of predict or differentiate different levels of psychological well-being. So meaning that those who didn't believe stress was bad for their health reported higher well-being compared to those who did believe stress was bad for their health. And this was among a group who were experiencing and reporting to experience the same levels of stress. And actually what we found was this stress mindset kind of explained about 13% of the association between stress and well-being. So, and that's not, for one individual factor in psychology, that's not a small amount. So this isn't the difference between people who are very stressed, believing that stress is not bad for their health and therefore being a 10 as opposed to a 5 out of 10. But this could be the difference between being a 5 and a 6, 5 or a 6, or a 5 and a 7. So these are sort of meaningful, significant, small changes in how we think, impacting upon or influencing the association between stress and well-being. So this is just something we wanted to share, linked to stress mindset.
I mean, I think that's fascinating, Elle, isn't it? I mean, there are, as Sinead's mentioned, that there are so many variables at play here, and you know, and those variables also change over time as well. So I think, yeah, putting this into perspective, this is just one of those variables, but it is having a significant impact, and I think it's something that's also been the subject of a huge amount of research. And I know you've been looking into this, Sinead. Can you just tell us a bit more about the relationship with stress and the stress mindset and what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, this is a really exciting and empowering area of research. I think this is something that can be immensely beneficial to people. And the idea is that actually we can change our stress mindset. We can change the relationship that we have to stress in a way that helps to moderate the impact that it has on our day-to-day lives. And the reason that we can do that is we have the capacity to challenge and check and change our thoughts. So the thoughts that we have in relation to the stress that we experience, and actually the thoughts that we have about stress itself, we can start to modify those. And our brains have this lovely neuroplastic ability. So over time, we can start to wire up more helpful patterns of thinking about stress, which then make us kind of feel differently towards stress, engage with it differently, and ultimately behave differently when it comes along. And I think for me, this is just a kind of really exciting emergent thing from the literature. And thank you so much to everyone that submitted questions in advance of this webinar. We've tried to weave as many in as we can, but somebody asked a really good question. And that question was, how do we know that it's the way we think about stress which impacts its experience on us? And I think that's a really good question. So is it not just the case that people who are really stressed are reporting that it has a bad impact, and therefore it's having that bad impact, and those that have lower levels of stress are reporting that it's fine? But actually we can see from ELL's data that's not the case. We can see from ELL's data that similarly high levels of stress, but thinking about it in different ways has a different impact. And also, I think this is where it gets really exciting when you look at stress mindset interventions. So people are interested in this area. Stanford University's Mind and Body Lab have a researcher there called Aaliyah Crum, who does a lot around mindset interventions. And what she's showing is that if you take a group of people through an intervention where you shift their stress mindset, where you move them from one of stress as threat to stress as enhancing, then actually you see a correlation and positive outcomes on how they perform at work, on their physical health, on their mood state. So this is really important stuff, because this isn't changing the stress that they encounter. This is changing the way they think about the stress that they encounter and that relationship. And I think what's really, really interesting is just building awareness in people of how to do this. It's simple techniques, but it takes repetition and time to build that up.
But it's also so difficult, isn't it? Because I mean, stress is an unpleasant sensation. So it's really around that focusing effect, isn't it? The more you focus on the unpleasant, or you don't want it, then, and the more you push it away, the bigger it becomes, because you can't actually push it away. It is a factor of your life. So what I think is really fascinating about this is it's the sort of that mindset concept is the attitude. It's the way that you welcome stress, the way that you're curious about it, the way that you work with it, as opposed to try and push it away, block it out. It's not something you can eradicate. And I think that so much of that sits in that mindset piece, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think that's where it's really, really interesting. And your bit about, welcoming almost and being curious about, that really goes to the acceptance side of the literature. So if we can accept that it is part of day-to-day life, so there will be stressful things that come our way, what we need to tune into actually is how do we manage it? How do we think about it? How do we respond to it? And so we always say the awareness bit comes first. So self-awareness of the things that are likely to be stressful to me, self-awareness of when I'm stressed, and then move into action. And the key bit, I think, around mindset is the ability to reframe the thoughts that we have. So to look at them again and to convert stress from something that is threatening into something that is challenging. And I suppose what we would always say is a really good way to do this is to begin by asking yourself a question. And that question is this SOS? Now, if it is SOS and you need to mobilize, if the building is on fire and you need to mobilize your resources, just go for it and do it. You need to act quickly. But often that fight or flight response gets triggered falsely. So something relatively small can put me into that state. So by asking that question, is this SOS? Well, if it's not actually, then I can start to challenge the thoughts that I'm having. And I'm starting to, rather than thinking there's no hope, I'm never going to get this done, everything's going to go horribly wrong, I can step back and say, well, okay, I've got 3 hours. What can I get done? How do I mobilize my resources? How do I use this energy that the stress has brought? How do I use this focus? So kind of starting to notice some of the benefits that come along and move towards solution-focused behaviors.
And it's sort of like a sort of triggering effect, isn't it? Because this links into the sort of what we call that sort of cognitive emotional fusion. So, you know, just by changing even that question will change how you think, how you feel, how you behave, and the actions that you take. And there's also, you know, there's a number of different portals into adjusting this, which could be behavioral. I mean, we can look into, you know, exercise, sleep, etc. So I think that's what's so interesting. What's so interesting about this space, and what you touched on there is, you know, these are some of the individual techniques and skills that you can build around this. And I suppose, you know, that's what we look to do. You know, positive and part of the program is to build those psychological skills which can impact on your health, your well-being, your performance. But one of the things that that I think we're also interested in is there's obviously a number of factors here, but the individual element is a huge one, but the environment is also a really big one. And I think we're seeing this play out really clearly at the moment. And Elle, I know we've looked at some of the data here, because I think we can't really look at this without thinking about the sort of the contagion around this, and how the environments that we operate in, the workplaces we're in, the people we come into play with, have an influence on this. So can you just share with us some of the findings we've seen from a sort of more cultural perspective around this?
Yeah, sure. Stress mindset on slides. Cool. Okay. Yeah, so some of the questions, so we asked about all sorts of things. So when we did this latest sort of data drive in September, we asked people about the amount of support they were experiencing. So we asked people about the amount of support they felt they were receiving from their colleagues, from their line managers, and from senior leadership during the pandemic. And we asked them again to score that on a scale of 1 to 10. And what's really fascinating about this data is the fact that what you see is, so we had lots and lots of firms contributing towards this. I think there could have been sort of 50-ish firms, all quite small firms. So what's interesting is what we saw across the board was individuals were reporting that if they had good support from colleagues, they tended to have good support from line managers, and they tended to have good support from senior leadership. So what we saw was really high correlations from all these different types of support. And what that's suggestive of is the fact that there are these sorts of supportive environments where that's the norm, and there are these less supportive environments within the workplace. So because of these correlations in the data, you can essentially just break down, you're able to characterize people's environments as low support, medium support, or high support environments. And these are indicative of culture, sort of the shared mindsets and behaviors of groups of individuals. So these are suggestive of sort of cultural differences within organizations. And what we looked at was based on this, so we're looking at quite sort of, we're looking at variables that are obviously quite far removed from individuals in terms of the cultural variables. What we looked to understand was, did we see that in supportive cultures, people were less stressed than in sort of high sort of, so in less supportive cultures, were they sort of more stressed than in very supportive cultures? What we did find was a significant difference. So culture's sort of levels of support was predictive of stress levels. And this is kind of intuitive, I guess. So if you've got a really supportive culture, you're likely to feel less stressed, perhaps in the context of work, because not only do you perhaps you work in a sort of more supportive environment where people are more understanding around deadlines or the pressures they put upon their staff, but equally, I think for me, the most essential thing around this support variable is the fact that as individuals, if we perceive we have a lot of support, we feel sort of this, like in terms of our internal resources to cope, we feel like we have a lot more sort of ability behind us. So coming back to this definition of external demands and internal resources, humans who feel really supported, that is an internal resource, because they know that they can draw on resources externally if they need to. And I think this is a really sort of nice message around highlighting that there is lots we can do at the individual level to tweak the dial of how stressed we are. And as we say, this might be the difference between a 6 and a 5. But these little differences are really important. So you could see how if you were working on your stress mindset and you worked in a more supportive team where everyone tries to support each other better in relation to sort of the workload demands or whatever that might be, you can start to see how lots of things collectively can have this sort of a cumulative effect, which does really start to help buffer against the adverse effects of stress. But yeah, and there's sort of no silver bullet here. It's a bit like weight loss or trying to get fit. You know, there's sort of lots of small things we can do, but collectively, and the stats support that they do make a significant difference. And those are individual and social.
I just wanted to ask you a question on that first slide, because you've got 3 levels of support there. You've got senior leadership support, line manager support, and I think peer support. Do they correlate? So when you see senior leadership support, do you see better results, down the organization?
So you see that, so just higher levels of support at senior leadership. Do you mean support levels that are consistently high across levels, or stress levels?
No, support levels. So if you perceive senior leadership to be supportive, do you see that sort of cascade down through levels? So are they linked?
Yeah. So you see that there's sort of, whenever you see a strong correlation, all you can do is sort of apply the most logical rationale for that. And I think if you have a sort of a strong supportive leadership team, what you tend to see is those, because they're showing good support to the people under them, then that sort of becomes a social norm, and then they're more sort of supportive towards that, creates sort of cultures of supportive teams. And it probably also influences the people they employ, or sort of promote or reward internally. So but yeah, no, you definitely see, if you see the supportive nature of sort of senior leadership, you see that cascade downwards.
And I think that we've seen this in a lot of our research, is that perception of senior leadership is so important in terms of the cultural impact. And I think one of the commonalities we've seen across all of your work and the insights work we've done over the past, particularly 6 months, is this relationship between the interactions that leaders have with their teams, particularly the number and the quality of those interactions, and psychological health and well-being. I remember in the first report we did, it also linked through to levels of optimism, and it just strikes me, this is such an important factor. It's also probably the most controllable factor that organizations have, because actually you can really build those skills in leadership. You can actually create more supportive cultures, more supportive environments. This links through to levels of optimism, it links through to health, it links through to performance. So there's also that rationale, that business rationale to do it. I mean, Sinead, just coming to you, what's the why is this so relevant, so important? Because I mean, we talk so much about connection. It'd just be good to dig into, why is this having such an impact on our levels of stress?
Well, I think this is fascinating. And just before I launch into this, just to say, a few people have asked about ELL's data and if it's available. So we're going to be providing a link to this for anyone that's interested in kind of going through that data in more detail. But I think the social side of this is fascinating. Across all the work that we do that looks at psychological well-being, the perception of good social support and connection is one of the most powerful things, one of the most powerful drivers of good well-being. But to bring it specific to the stress response, the research here is really interesting, because if you look at oxytocin, which again, we've kind of dubbed the love hormone. So if you look at good connection and in a low stress state, so where the 3 of us are maybe meeting to go for a drink or whatever, we're in a low stress state, we're feeling connected. We have high levels of oxytocin there because it's a good bonding agent. But fascinatingly, also, when I go into a high stress state, the research has shown that I have a spike in oxytocin again. So it's present there when I'm at high stress and low stress. And one of the theories is that is driving me to go towards good social support, because good social support and connection is one of the most powerfully protective things that can buffer us from stress. And I love that idea that actually, if we could come together, and in 2020 we've seen lots of lovely examples of this, where people have come together and buffered each other from the challenges and the difficulties that come along. So I think that's really interesting. I think on the downside, stress can feel lonely. When you are experiencing high levels of stress, you can almost start to think that no one else gets it, that no one else is under the same pressure that you're under. And so you might withdraw from people. But actually, if we can engage with that kind of social stress response, where we, instead of withdrawing, we go towards our friends, our colleagues, our families, that can be just one of the best ways of managing the stress that does come our way. So I think the evolution of this is lovely. If we can build and develop our social networks, it puts us in a really good place to manage that stress.
And I think that's really one of the big challenges at the moment, isn't it? I mean, working predominantly a virtual space, and some people have, good support systems around them, some people less so. Everyone's context is very different, but it's also, as we mentioned at the beginning, it's different from generation to generation. So this is why I think there's that real difficult challenge to organizations to create supportive cultures in a virtual world. Have you got any thoughts around how that is achieved in the in the world that we're operating in at the moment?
I think we need careful thought and consideration around what works for our teams. So all of our teams work differently, but I think what we need to do is to give this careful consideration and to engage the good side of technology. We're often kind of demonizing social media and kind of online interactions, but at the minute when our reality is that we are increasingly working from distance and working in a virtual world, what we need to do is engage with technology to the best of our ability to enable us to connect with colleagues in ways that are meaningful. And I think one of the challenges is that, since the first kind of lockdown back earlier this year, what we've seen is an increase in the number of online meetings, but without necessarily building in that time for just the small chit chat that you would have when you're boiling the kettle or making a coffee. So I think if we can start to build less structured time for social interactions as well, and to go back to Elle's data, where we can start to make the time to check in, to demonstrate that we care what's going on for each other, not just inside of work, outside of work too, because people are isolated from their families at the moment. It's not business as usual in our personal lives either. So where we can really start to demonstrate care for each other and to build in time and to prioritize the little things that build good social capital, then that's just so important in this kind of increasingly virtual world.
Absolutely. I think you yeah, and it is those little things, and it's building those up, really, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so I suppose there seems to be a couple of things here that we've touched on. One is from an individual perspective, it's really around that relationship relationship with stress. I mean, obviously it's a really variable situation. There's all sorts of types of different stress, but there is something around this relationship that we hold with stress, and therefore the impact that has on us. And I think one of the key takeaways that I'm hearing is really around around normalizing it, and normalizing going to the right hand side of the Yerkes-Dodson, but then building the psychological skills and the capability to recognize that you're there and come back, and try not to let which is much easier said than done, try not to let that sort of cognitive emotional fusion kick in when you're in that mindset, to actually accept that you're there. It's normal to go there, but we've got to work out how we come back. And I think what we know is that you can actually achieve an awful lot through good psychoeducation around this. I mean, just that knowledge of how our brain works, what are the natural responses around this, how can we counteract that, can make a huge difference. And I think for individuals and organizations at the moment, that's probably a really key takeaway. I think from the from the organizational perspective, it's really interesting, isn't it, to think about how health can and psychological health can link into culture and performance. And I think so much of this is coming down to that point you've made just there, Sinead. It's around that human connection and the role modeling of these behaviors. I think the real focus seems to be on leadership. and actually how they can, build up their psychological skills, which, the world's changed so much over the last sort of few months. So I think being able to, build those skills, increase that tolerance of uncertainty. And, it's no surprise that, there's some of the research showing that, if you increase your tolerance of uncertainty, or leadership teams that do this, CEOs that do this, outperform CEOs with lower tolerance about uncertainty. So, I think it's this combination of that psychological health and performance, which is, which can actually drive your culture in the right direction. Any thoughts on that before we finish from either of you?
Elle perhaps does. I just wanted to pick up on someone sent through a really, really good question, which I think is really important. So essentially, if we think back to the Yerkes-Dodson, and when we talk about the high stress state and high levels of cortisol, the impact that has on our health over time, are we suggesting that thinking differently about things like minimizes the impact that cortisol has on us? I think what's really important there is that actually how we think about stress can help move us back to the top. And when we're back at the top, the cortisol levels aren't at that kind of pervasive chronic high level. Yeah. So I think it's about thinking about shifts in our thinking that move us, or actions that we can take that move us back towards the top again. Elle, I don't know if you have anything to add to Will's question.
Yeah, and then actually just on that question you were answering, because I think the crucial point for me around this, the definition around us, so if we're exposed to a threatening or difficult situation, we don't automatically just become stressed. So there has to be this appraisal by ourselves that kind of before the stress response is triggered. So I think the only things that can really trigger our stress response in the absence of that psychologically being processed are things like nicotine and caffeine. So if you're stressed, that's why they say don't drink coffee, because without even trying, you'll further trigger your stress response. So I think it's just starting to appreciate that the stress response is triggered by the psychological appraisal between the external and the internal. So there's lots of things you can try and do to shift that balance. Obviously, as we mentioned, with chronic stress, so big life events, it's going to be more difficult to really sort of shift those. But we're talking about sort of everyday stressors where you might be able to reframe some of them and just tweak that dial down a little bit on stress. And if I'm honest, I can't remember what Will's question was. So what was that?
I think you've answered it perfectly. Okay, I'm just aware of time. I just want to share with everyone that's joined today. Thank you very much for joining. It's great to see so much interest in what we're doing. We are one of the things we've just launched is an open program for what we call the Positive Leaders program. So this is something we've been running with organizations for many years. We launched it in October. Very successfully, and we've actually got a new cohort starting in February 21. So if anyone tuned in today wants to get involved with the Positive Leaders program to understand the skills across those 4 key pillars of our program, do get in touch. You can email us at info@positivegroup.org and we can send you more details. And there's a discount on early bird entry for that this year. And then just lastly, we've got more to come on the webinar front. We're actually going to be really concentrating on the concept of connection in the latter part of the year, because it's such a fundamental protective factor. So we've got 2 great webinars that we're working on now. So I'm going to be interviewing along with Sinead, I think, Tim Matthews, who is a renowned researcher in the space of loneliness, which should be fascinating. And then we're going to follow that up with looking at connection in the virtual world and what can we practically do to improve levels of human connection. Just want to say thank you to everyone for joining us, and a huge thank you to Elle and Sinead, who have been insightful and brilliant as ever. Have a great rest of the day and hopefully see you all soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.